This morning we hear this passage that centers around one of the most ordinary things in life, something that we can't avoid thinking about for more than 4 or 5 hours: food. We hear a story that talks about these very, very basic necessities: bread and fish. Growing up, one of our birthday traditions was that the birthday boy or girl, whoever it was, got to pick the meal that we would have for that dinner. Whatever we wanted, anything in the whole grocery store was at our fingertips to pick. In a family of 7, where you don't always get to pick what you want, this was a bigger deal than it sounds. I remember lots and lots of birthday dinners, but I only remember ever picking one meal. It was always spaghetti with shrimp and marinara sauce, cheddar cheese shredded on top, and milk to drink. No matter how old I was turning, I always picked the exact same thing. Even though I had ultimate freedom, I could pick anything I wanted. That simple meal was what I wanted. Only one way to satisfy my birthday hunger. In our reading today, the disciples are faced with a hungry crowd. They followed Jesus far away from the villages up to the mountainside. The crowds are getting bigger every minute. This crowd has been such a faithful witness. And so when the day draws to a close, the disciples look around with compassion. They say, "Jesus, look at these hungry people. Look at the setting sun. It's time to call it quits. They're hungry, and there's only one way to feed them. Let's send them into town." Just as I seem to be conditioned to think that there was only one possible birthday meal, the disciples were conditioned to think that there was only one way to feed such a big crowd. There's no caterers to call. They couldn't order pizza or have Uber drop off McDonald's for them. Nothing programmed into their speed dial or menus saved and taped up to the refrigerator. And so the disciples do things like they've always done. They want to send the crowd out on foot to find a store or a house, someone who would share enough bread with each person. But Jesus knows that there's something different about this meal. There's something new, something radical, that's unlike every time that we think about our bellies every few hours. This simple thing, Jesus turns into a radically new, miraculous thing. This story of the loaves and the fishes is one of the most common in the Gospels. It occurs 5 times, told even in some of the Gospels twice. Twice in Matthew, twice in Mark, once in Luke. Many different details in the different versions. But our story begins with Jesus' disciples being overwhelmed with this crowd that keeps coming to him. They try to withdraw to a solitary place up on top of the mountain, but the people press on. They just can't get enough of this amazing presence of Jesus. They walk many miles just to sit and listen and see the healings that he will do. And when Jesus sees them, he has compassion with them. Compassion means suffering with. He sees the crowd and he sees their pain. And suddenly he takes this ordinary thing and he turns it into enough for everyone. When we seek Jesus, when we go out into the unordinary places in our lives will never be the same. Jesus takes these little talents that we have, knitting and quilting, crocheting, making dinner, and Jesus turns them into something extraordinary. When we go out to meet Jesus in the wilderness of poverty, when we go out to do something as simple as spend an hour of our time in the food bank, God turns that little commitment into something extraordinary as providing food for a family in a desperate time. When we come to a funeral, offer the words of comfort that always seem awkward and never seem like enough. When we just show up, God turns that little thing into a whole feast, a feast of abundant joy, where one day there will be no more weeping, no more crying, no more tears shed, where we will be present with God forever. I remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, going through my first communion class. And part of our first communion class was always going to the pastor's house. The last thing we would do in preparation at the last class for that special meal to come is that we would mix our own bread. We would put together the water and the flour, the oil. With our little first grade clumsy hands and fingers, we were taught how to knead it, how to start to feel the yeast bubbling and growing. It took a lot of patience. We would go back and have our lesson, and every 15 minutes we would go and check and see just how much it had grown, waiting for that yeast to rise right before our eyes. We looked on as the loaves were placed in the hot oven. We took deep breaths of that sweet, sweet smell of bread baking in the oven, filling the house. I don't remember so much about my lessons, but I do remember that visceral experience of making the bread. And in that bread, God takes these ordinary ingredients, turned it into this extraordinary thing of a child's first communion. Something ordinary placed into extraordinary hands. God's promise of presence that happens every single week here at our table where God meets us. We come to lay down our burdens at the feet of God. And God does something extraordinary. God picks them back up. And the bread and the wine, simple, ordinary things, God is with us, sustaining us, nurturing us with that little tiny piece of bread, bit of wafer, just as vital as those daily meals that happen every 5 or 6 hours. Though my birthday dinners were always the same, ordinary spaghetti, noodles, regular old out-of-the-jar sauce, each time one of us rounded the corner of another birthday year, something about that meal was special. My parents took ordinary and made it extraordinary. And here, each and every week, we learn again that we are not alone. We are bound to community together. We are growing into the people that God calls us to be. A new chaplain once came to a hospital, and she decided that part of her ministry was to go around and bless the hands of those who were caring for everyone in the hospital. She started with the nurses and the doctors, people you would see every day. And she realized if she was really going to make a difference, she should move on to the administrators. And she looked for more and more people. And finally, she found herself one day down in the basement. She found one of the surgery technicians whose job it was to go through, make sure that there was sterile equipment put into each of the surgical trays. For each person, she had a name and a number. She had a list of what equipment was needed for that surgery. And as the chaplain blessed her hands, the woman told her about how every time when she double-checked the list, made sure everything was there, placed the paper back on the top of the sealed tray, she would look again at the person's name and pray for that person who was going through surgery that day. I don't know how long it would take for this woman to get to 5,000 surgeries, but I would imagine in a busy hospital with 10 or 20 surgeries every single day, it wouldn't take more than 6 months or a year. Every time one of those prayers was shared, it becomes something extraordinary. Jesus took bread and fish, and by holding it up, blessing it. He called the whole assembly into something extraordinary, into the abundant process of sharing and caring. Here at the table, we again receive that extraordinary gift. And just like a birthday celebration, God calls us into God's presence of joy, rejoicing that one day we will all be fed with the bread of life, loved as God's children forever. Amen.